Why has US President Donald Trump imposed tariffs on countries all around the world? And in particular, why is Trump waging a trade war on China? What are his real goals? Well, to try to answer these questions, I spoke with the economist Michael Hudson, who is the author of many books and who just published the new report, Return of the Robber Barons, Trump's Distorted View of U.S. Tariff History. Michael Hudson outlined the history of the use of tariffs in the United States and in other countries, and he explained how Trump is using tariffs as a weapon of class war to benefit the rich at the expense of the vast majority of the population, and also how Trump is trying to reshape the global financial system in order to benefit the United States at the expense of everyone else. But as Michael Hudson warns, this is already backfiring on the US economy, and it's accelerating the transition to a more multipolar world. So here are a few clips from our discussion, and then we'll go straight to the interview.
The United States is the only country in the world that has weaponized its foreign trade, weaponized its foreign currency, the dollar, weaponized the international financial system, and treated every economic relationship in an adversarial way to weaponize it. And other countries say, how can we have a different approach and treat trade as how can we mutually gain? How can we treat investment as something where the investor gains, but we also gain? So what's happening is that as other countries are putting in place their mutual production facilities, transportation facilities, investment facilities, Trump is isolating the United States from trade and investment relations. It's tried to isolate China. But what it's doing is isolating itself from everyone except its satellites.
Michael, thanks for joining me. It's always a pleasure. Let's start by talking about this report that you published, and you outlined the history of U.S. use of tariffs and industrial policy, and your argument that Trump is using tariffs essentially as a form of class warfare to move the burden off of the rich and corporations and to increase the burden of taxation on the working class through the use of tariffs. So can you talk about what your argument is in this report and why you decided to write it?
Well, it's much more than simply class warfare. Trump has for years been complaining about the fact that the richest people are taxed progressively at a higher tax rate than other people. He wants to get rid of the tax rate altogether for the finance, insurance, and real estate sector, the fire sector. And I think he must have had a discussion with some economist or historian and said, isn't there some way that we can get by without an income tax? And the person must have told him, well, you know, the United States didn't have an income tax before 1913. And Trump said, no income tax? No, the Supreme Court ruled that an income tax was unconstitutional. That's what Supreme Courts do. They try to prevent any kind of progressive social legislation. Well, finally, in 1913, the Senate passed the 14th Amendment and enabled an income tax to be levied. So Trump said, well, how did the United States finance itself before that? And the answer was, well, almost all the U.S. tax fiscal revenues came from the tariff, from customs receipts, in addition to land sales for land that they've grabbed from the Indians. So Trump said, well, they did it through tariffs. Well, the advantage of tariffs for Trump is that the cost falls on consumers. He doesn't see that they also fall on companies that import goods from their foreign affiliates, but ultimately Trump said, "Oh, this is on consumers. This is wonderful. Why couldn't we go back to the way things used to be today? Why can't we get rid of the income tax altogether? At least on my constituency, the campaign donors, and why can't we simply raise tariffs?" Well, his associates must have said, well, however are you going to convince people to go along with this? And so Trump said, well, let's see, under tariff protection, late 19th century, that's how the United States rose to be a great industrial power. So somehow tariffs must have nurtured industry, and I want to bring industrialization back to the United States, make America great again. And I can say tariffs are going to bring back industry. And what he means is untaxing the wealthy people, especially the finance and real estate sector, and shifting the tax on to consumers is going to make the country great again. Well, what he's leaving out is the fact that it wasn't tariffs as such that made America into an industrial power. There was a whole large program that was necessary to industrialize America. And all of this was spelled out in the 1820s by Henry Clay, and it was called the American system. And the American system was protective tariffs with internal improvements. That means public investment in infrastructure and a national banking system to finance industry. Well, Trump said nothing about these, and so it's worth saying something about them. By the late 19th century, the United States said, how are we going to lower the cost that industry has to pay for its wages without leading to a huge round of strikes? Well, and the solution was, well, we can have the public sector pick up many of the costs that labor would otherwise have to pay out of its own paychecks for education. We can have free education, not the $50,000 a year that workers have to pay today in order to get a job. We can have social programs, health programs, and others to help them. We can have natural monopolies in the public domain, such as transportation, starting with the Erie Canal and going all the way through roads and other transportation, communications. All of these natural monopolies, if they were not held in the public domain, would be owned by private people who would get monopoly rents. And the United States said the way that we can compete with other countries is pretty much the way that the classical economists said you compete. You lower the cost of production by having the government bear as many of these costs as possible through public enterprises, through public infrastructure. You make them, you essentially socialize or nationalize the land. And the socialism was not a bad word in the late 19th century. Almost everyone across the political spectrum was describing their policies as socialist. There was Christian socialist and libertarian socialist and Marxian socialist and social democracy. Everybody was one kind of socialist or another, and it meant a rising role of government in providing more and more services or regulating the economy, such as the antitrust law of 1890 to prevent monopoly pricing, and Teddy Roosevelt's trust busting. The whole idea was to minimize the cost of production with an active government. And they said that, well, if we can have a mixed economy, public and private economy together, with the government sponsoring industrial credit, not the kind of British credit that was just for trade or exploitative or loans to farmers, but actually to finance capital investment in industry, then we can take off. And it was this context for protective tariffs that enabled the United States to get rich. Well, what Trump wants to do is the exact opposite of this context. He wants to deregulate the economy, not regulate it. He wants to privatize the public any public domain that's left, any public enterprises. The post office, for instance, can be privatized. It's going to cut back services to rural areas. It's going to increase prices. It's going to make most of the U.S. economy look like Thames Water in London, for instance. They're going to Thatcherize the American economy, to do to the American economy what Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair did for England, or what Reaganomics began to do for the United States. So we're talking about an anti-government policy, not a mixed policy. And under Elon Musk, he wants to just carve up the government agencies altogether, privatize everything. And what you're going to do is dismantle the country's social programs, dismantle its subsidies, dismantle subsidized social programs that have enabled companies like Amazon or other low-wage companies to pay very low wages, and having the American social system pay for employees that are paid below the poverty line, because they haven't been increasing the minimum wage in the United States. So this is what is really in store for the U.S. Essentially privatize the government, especially get rid of Social Security and other social programs, Medicare, and they call it streamlining the economy, or making a free market, a market without government that interferes by protecting consumers, protecting the population against predatory monopolies and predatory finance.
Yeah, Michael, you raised so many important points there. I want to hit on this idea of the Gilded Age, that Trump sees the Gilded Age in the 19th century as essentially his model for what the U.S. should return to. And the Gilded Age is notorious for the robber barons, these big billionaires like Cornelius Vanderbilt and J.P. Morgan. And today there are, of course, similar oligarchs. Many of them are in the Trump administration, including Elon Musk, who's the richest billionaire oligarch on earth. You have the Treasury Secretary, another billionaire hedge fund manager, Scott Bessent. Then you have the billionaire who is the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick. He's also from Wall Street. And of course, at his inauguration in January, Trump invited the world's most powerful billionaires like Mark Zuckerberg, like Jeff Bezos, Tim Cook, and others. So one of the points that you emphasize is that Trump is really trying to overturn not only the progressive gains of the New Deal, but even the gains of the progressive era in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And when Trump looks back at people like McKinley, the US president, he sees essentially the 19th century and the Gilded Age as something positive. Of course, the vast majority of the population was exploited and lived in horrible conditions, but for a small handful of oligarchs, the situation was quite rosy for them. So why do you think Trump sees it this way?
Well, what Trump doesn't realize is that the Gilded Age was a failure of U.S. protectionism. In the process of protecting industrial investment, you had financial the sector making a lot of money off this. And finance has always been the mother of trusts. And the finance began to lead to a fight over who's going to control the railroads. The crisis of 1873 came when Jay Cooke's railroad defaulted. There were rivals trying to buy control of railroads from each other. The Gilded Age emerged sort of accidentally as a byproduct of making industry rich. You also made a lot of opponents of industry rich, like monopolists. And that's why in the year of the McKinley tariff, when he was a congressman in 1890, you had the Sherman antitrust law. They said, okay, we're going to make sure that the protection of industry does not become protection of monopolies. It will not become a protection of unearned wealth, economic rent seeking. So Trump gets it all backwards, that what was an oversight that the Americans cured in 1890, or at least started to put in place a public mechanism for avoiding the Golden Age, as if that was actually a great success. If only it had succeeded, Trump would say, then America would have polarized and done what Gilded Ages do.
Yeah, and one of the points that you emphasized, Michael, is how China's model is completely different. China is following the kind of state-led industrial policy that every industrialized economy has used to industrialize, to develop a manufacturing sector. China has state ownership of telecommunications, infrastructure, education, energy, land, and finance. Most importantly, the financial system in China is state-owned. And China has 5-year plans in which they target certain industries that they want to develop. China creates plans for sectors like electric vehicles, and they say that the government is going to direct resources into these industries through the use of subsidies and infrastructure investment and job training and education and cheap loans from state-owned banks. And they're going to develop semiconductors. They're going to develop local civilian airliners. So can you contrast China's industrial policy with the Trump administration's lack of an industrial policy?
Well, you could say, could I compare China's development to the policies of the United States and also Germany when it was developing? And China has sort of reinvented the wheel. One of the first books of mine that they translated as a textbook into Chinese was my book on trade development and foreign debt, when I described the contrast between free trade and protectionism and how the United States developed a protectionist argument to counter the free trade arguments of England in order to protect the industry. So China has essentially done the same logical thing that any government would have to do. You have to subsidize your own industry and protect it and insulate it from lower cost imports underselling you. You have to enable industry, if not really to make a profit, to at least make enough money to somehow be able to pay its labor force and to pay for the raw materials and the machinery that it takes to create in industrial production. The one thing that China has done that other countries did not do, although Germany began to do it in the 19th century, was to keep money and credit as a public utility. And China did this because it really didn't have much of a choice after Mao's revolution. How is the government going to finance capital investment in industry? And what was a very poor country of peasants, basically, as the U.S. Secretary of Commerce keeps calling China, a country of peasants.
U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance referred to the Chinese as a bunch of peasants, and that this has really angered people in China.
We borrow money from Chinese peasants to buy the things those Chinese peasants manufacture. That is not a recipe for economic prosperity.
And this has really united people in China against the U.S.
Of course. Well, at any rate, since Mao's revolution had got rid of the wealthy financial classes, there was no way that the government could do what the Western countries did and borrow from the wealthy classes to pay for the government deficit in financing industry. So China created its own money. Well, that's exactly what the American colonies did in the 18th and 17th century, when Britain was dominating the colonies and forcing the colonies to export crops and other materials by borrowing hard money from British merchants. The colonies began to create their own paper money. And that's how they basically developed. When America fought the Revolutionary War, the government issued continentals, fiat currency called continental currency. And in the Civil War, when America, the costs of the war were so large that it couldn't possibly borrow from domestic creditors, the government printed greenbacks. But in peacetime, the financial sector fought back and insisted in sound money, meaning money that you pay interest on to private financiers. Well, since China didn't have private financiers, it did just same thing that America had done. It printed the money itself, and it kept banking in the public domain. And what that meant is that banking in China does not make loans for the same kind of things that American banks make loans. We know that they went overboard in making fairly reckless real estate loans, but they don't make loans for corporate takeovers of private investors to borrow the money to take over another industrial corporation and just sort of empty it out and do what American corporate raiders and kleptocrats do. So China has been able to create money to spend into the economy for purposes intended to serve the public interest, to build up housing, to finance high-speed railways, to finance all of the public infrastructure that China has kept in the public domain to offer at low subsidized prices to the population at large, so that if you have a private enterprise in China creating a factory to produce goods for exports to the United States or other countries, they don't have to pay the workers enough to have to pay for privatized transportation. They have wonderful public transportation and the subways, the railroads. They don't have to take out student loans to get an education. They can get the education from the public sector in China. They can get health care. They don't have to pay for all of the things that the United States employees and employers have to pay for, and that's what enables China to have low-cost labor. It's not that it's impoverished labor. It's not that it's pauper labor. It's because the labor in China is better and better remunerated, but its remuneration is not only in the form of its paychecks that it gets in salary, it's in the form of all of the public services that it gets that Americans have to pay out of their salary. So when you realize that the standard of living of workers is not only the paycheck, but the public services they get or the subsidized prices that they have to pay for basic needs, then you find that if basic needs are traded as basic needs, then everybody should be able to get them and is a precondition for being citizens. And that's basically what happens in China. And that's what has enabled China to undersell Western economies that have privatized and Thatcherized and Reaganized their economies. And of course, that's how the United States and Germany and other countries that industrialized in the late 19th century built up their competitive power internationally.
Well, once again, well said. I was speaking with the economist Michael Hudson, and I will link to his most recent report on Donald Trump's tariffs and the robber barons and the Gilded Age. That will be in the description below, and you can read that. Thanks so much for joining me, Michael. It's always a real pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks for having me again, Ben.